Now let's talk about 3 different options you have for how to handle an objection in particular. So option number 1 is you can comply with the objection. So what this looks like is prospect says, I'm busy right now. Okay, sorry to bother you. Prospect says, I'm not interested. Okay, have a great day. Complying is basically going along with the objection, giving in, accepting the objection. Option 2 is to overcome the objection. So this is, if someone says, I'm not interested, you might say something like, oh, well, but we typically increase sales by 30%. Are you saying that you don't need to increase sales or aren't interested in an increase by 30%? So what that is that's me trying to overcome the objection. Their mindset is, I'm not interested. I'm giving them more information to try to make them interested. The third option is to deflect the objections. Example for this might be if you can think back to the Karate Kid with the wax on and the wax off to block the karate kicks and karate hits. And so that's what this is like. So you're still getting hit a little bit, but you're trying to deflect and block away the objection so that you don't take a direct hit and that you're not trying to hit back, but you're trying to deflect so that you can keep the conversation moving forward. So let me give you an example. So if the prospect says, you know what, I'm not interested. Hey, listen, I understand, but if I could ask you real quick, are you guys using any type of formal sales methodology today, specifically in the area of handling objections? So what I just did there is I didn't try to make them interested. I deflected to a question. And the logic there is that the question doesn't make them interested. The question hopefully gets away from the objection. When they answer the question, I can then either ask another question, I can go somewhere else in my cold call script based on their answer. I have a lot of different options. I'm also gathering information. So instead of them getting rid of me, when they answer my question, I'm getting more information from them. So I'm totally turning the situation around 180 degrees from getting shot down to getting information and keeping the call going. The other thing is that most likely if you face an objection and you deflect with a question, then most likely the prospect will not go back to the objection. For example, if the prospect says, I'm not interested, and I say, I understand, do you mind if I ask if you're using a methodology? It's very unlikely that the prospect is going to just say, listen, I told you, I said I'm not interested. That is if you respond, if you're using more of a consultative selling approach where you're asking good questions and you aren't giving off that I'm a product pushing, product selling salesperson. It's when you give off that product pushing impression that you start to face more rejection, more resistance, more difficulty from the prospect. Deflecting with a question, most likely it's going to lead to some sort of answer. It could be a I don't know, it could be a yes, but we're fine, or might not lead to a great answer, but most likely the objection is not going to be the response or answer to your question. Now, the key to deflecting is knowing what questions to ask or what to say in order to deflect, and I'll show you what all that looks like later in this presentation. So here are those 3 different options for handling objections, and the reality is that you should use all 3 of these different options at different times. To comply, at some point you do need to comply with objections. You just don't want to comply first or comply very quickly or easily. You want to try something else, and at some point you might need to give in and accept the objection. A good rule of thumb is if you face an objection, try to get around it 2 or 3 times with a different response, and then you can start to try to maybe comply. And it's not to say it'll completely walk away when you comply, but you might accept and go along with that objection. Now, to overcome, you primarily want to try to only overcome when you're at the meeting step or the presentation step. When you're trying to overcome, there's 2 things involved. One is you need some time and attention in order to build your case. So if you're trying to change someone's mind, that can be a difficult thing to do. And if you're at the initial contact step, you'd want to try to avoid overcoming because you don't have the time and attention at that step. It's only going to be a quick conversation. And you also don't really need to overcome the objection at the initial contact because you're just trying to progress to the meeting. Now, when you're at the meeting step, if your prospect has an objection and it might be a valid concern, you don't want to just deflect it and ignore it. You want to learn more about it and maybe see if it is a real issue. And the meeting is a good step to do that. The presentation is a good step to do that. Now with deflecting is what you should do primarily at the initial contact step only, and you don't really necessarily want to deflect too much at the meeting step, because if your prospect has a valid concern, you don't want to just ignore it and try to keep the conversation going. You need to really understand their concerns and see if they're legitimate or showstoppers or something that you can resolve.